Do you remember the Battle of the Century? The great prize fight in Boyle's 30 acres between Dempsey and Carpentier?
Yes, I covered it. I covered it for the Baltimore Sun and the New York World. There was a very curious episode, that fight. There were a lot of professional sports reporters there, and they were all unanimously in favor of Carpentier for sentimental reasons. Dempsey, it appeared, had not been a war hero, and Carpentier had. And while it was plain to a child who looked at him that Carpentier couldn't conceivably beat Dempsey, why, these reporters, some of whom were very good, constantly sought during the fight for evidences of Carpentier making some impression on Dempsey. And in the 8th round, Carpentier happened to hit Dempsey, who staggered a bit, as a man will when he's caught off his balance. And the stories the next day, some of them, all were to the effect that Carpentier had nearly knocked out Dempsey. Well, I was innocent and ignorant, not being a sporting reporter, and I didn't mention any such episode. I mentioned the fact that he'd been hit him, but reported that he hadn't made any impression on him whatever. This developed into a controversy, and some of the sporting professionals insisted that Dempsey had been staggered. And after the controversy went on for a week or two, it occurred to somebody to go to see Carpentier and Dempsey. And Dempsey's reply was that he hadn't felt the thing at all, and Carpentier's reply was that so far as he knows, he hadn't made any impression on Dempsey whatsoever. That is a wonderful proof, of which there are many, that people believe what they want to believe. Now, the feeling against Dempsey at that fight was very bitter. And some of the sporting experts shared it. And another thing that I derived as a moral from the whole episode is this, that so-called experts are just ordinary men at bottom, and that you can't trust them, their judgment in an emotional situation any more than you can trust anybody else's.
Well, Dempsey went on, as you know, to live down his reputation as a draft dodger and became one of the most popular men in sports. Later on, I think we should say that in justice to Dempsey.
Oh, without doubt.
Has been a pretty decent and...
There was nothing wrong with Dempsey.
He was badly managed.
He was badly managed. I didn't hold anything against him on the ground that he wasn't a war hero. I wasn't myself.
But we don't want Dempsey misjudged 1,000 years from now when somebody plays back this record.
Well, naturally not. I think Dempsey later on kept a saloon in New York, which I often went into, which had good food and the best mint juleps ever served in New York. Old Edgar Lee Masters and I used to go in there and always drink a couple of those mint juleps. He charged $1 for them 15 years ago, and they were well worth it.
I don't think you'd better go on record as a mint julep drinker. Isn't beer your main...
I don't drink much beer. That's a legend that's...
I know, but I mean, haven't you always been a connoisseur of beer and a champion of beer as a drink?
Yes, I think beer is a cheap, excellent drink.
I mean, you were always making us thirsty during Prohibition by mentioning the better brands of European beer with which you were acquainted. I remember that distinctly.
I naturally, when I went abroad, drank the wine of the country. And if I was in Germany or Denmark, I drank beer. If I was in Italy, I certainly wouldn't drink beer, or Spain, or even France, although the German beers were always for sale in France. That was an exaggeration, my beer drinking. I'm actually ambibulous. I drink every known alcohol drink.
What was that word?
Ambibulous.
That's a very fine word.
I drink every known alcoholic drink and enjoy them all. And I've always learnt early in life how to handle alcohol and never had any trouble with it. The rules are as simple as mud. First, never drink if you've got any work to do. Never. If I've got a job of work to do at 10 o'clock at night, I wouldn't take a drink up to that time. Secondly, never drink alone. That's the way to become a drunkard. And thirdly, even if you haven't got any work to do, never drink while the sun is shining. Wait until it's dark. By that time, you're near enough to bed to recover quickly. I think the danger of alcohol is largely consists of this. If a man starts to drink too early in the day, or when he's got anything that puts a strain on him to do, as the alcohol goes out, or even while it's still in, he notices a letting down. No man can work as well with alcohol in him. He notices a letting down, and he's tempted to drink some more, which removes that feeling of being let down. And the result is he gets on a wheel, and he drinks too much. I am fond of drinking a reasonable amount. My doctor tells me that in his judgment, and he's one of the best doctors in America, alcohol to a man over 60 is not only harmless, but a positive benefit. He said it has an effect on the heart muscle that seems to be very salubrious, and that the man who drinks a moderate amount, at least according to my program, is not only not harmed but benefited, which is good news to me.
As you know, I myself evolved or degenerated into a dramatic critic. Didn't you? That's what I was going to ask you. Yeah. Weren't you a drama critic at one time?
That's true. I was a dramatic critic for, 7 or 8 years. What's more, I was a good one, as I once proved to my old colleague George Nason, who looked on me as a mere amateur, and I dug up some of my old criticisms and showed that I was saying the things 10 years before that all the rest of the boys were saying then. For instance, I was not fooled by the frauds of that era. That was the era of 1905 to 10, say. The country was full of them, all kinds of terrible plays that were being produced and taken seriously, plays by Augustus Thomas and Charles Klein. I always treated them as trash. There were stars at that time who were looked on with reverence by the public. I always treated them as trash. One of the great heroes of the time that I tackled once was Richard Mansfield. He was a kind of demigod in those days. And I told the truth about him when he played in a play called Don Juan by Schiller. He was playing an 18-year-old boy, and he was a man in the 50s. And he looked it. And it was a foul and terrible performance. Well, it got under Mansfield's skin, and he wrote me some letters protesting and invited me to come to see him, which I never did. In those days, I made it a rule never to meet an actor if I could help it.
A very good rule.
Yeah, it was a good rule. I had nothing to do with stage people. I naturally knew some of them. Some of them I was very fond of. But I did not frequent theater society, and never in my life did I go to a theater party given by a manager to celebrate the opening of a new play, and I assume that they still give such parties, do they?
No more. The theater is too poor at present.
Yeah.
The movie people give the party.
Do they?
They're ghastly. They're worse than the theater parties. To come back to something that I intended to ask, what do you think of the newspaper guild as an influence in journalism?
I think it's been I think the idea of the newspaper guild is good, but that the influence of the guild has been bad. Almost unqualifiedly bad, for the reason that it got in the hands of the wrong men. Beginning with the first of them, Hayward Prune. As I said some time ago, I've been sold down the river 3 times in my life. Papers sold or busted under me. It happened that every time, having been born lucky, it was a good thing for me. But I saw and knew intimately many men for whom it was a dreadfully tragic thing. And I always believed that the men on a newspaper, or any group of men, ought to have some machinery for compensating their individual impotence. I lived through the time when a old-time ice wagon driver city editor might come down in the morning with a hangover and fire a man simply because he was in bad humor. That is not theory. I've seen it done. I was a city editor and fired men, but I never did it for that reason. But I probably did it for reasons that were just as irrational. I didn't like the man. I believe that if a man works for any institution or industry for a given time, for a reasonable time, so that he's settled down into his job, he requires a kind of vested interest in his job. And it ought to be impossible to fire him wantonly and without compensation. All that I'm in favor of. I think that the man as a whole, as a group, can always bargain with the administration better than men alone. I'm in favor of that. But when the Guild began to develop, it turned out very quickly that the Guild was a conspiracy of the more incompetent and useless men on newspapers, not only against the boss, but also against the good men. That, like any other labor union, it began to be dominated by the selling platers. And it hence made its fight along lines that were, to me, silly. For instance, its fight to greatly exaggerate and increase the wages of office boys and of all of the third-rate people that hang around the edges of a newspaper staff. When I negotiated with the Guild, as you may remember, I tried hard to separate the actual newspaper men from all these auxiliaries. I don't care. I think the auxiliaries ought to be represented. But they ought not dominate the Guild. The newspaper men ought to speak for themselves. I never, as a negotiator for the Sun, objected to any reasonable demand made by the men. I don't know whether you remember that negotiation.
I do.
But I was always in favor of what the men, the actual good men, wanted, including some things that were expensive to the paper or seemed to me a little bit irrational. But nevertheless, I think a man is entitled to be a little irrational about himself. But when they began taking in girls who take want ads, telephone operators, and all such people, I washed my hands of it. I don't believe that's a newspaper guild anymore. It's just simply a gang of force-rate employees with the newspaper men as unwilling perfumers. I think the Guild, it would be very well advised if it sloughed off all of those auxiliaries and went back to being a newspaper guild. It would then be dignified. The bosses would lose 3/4 of their arguments against it. And the higher administration on newspapers would be more friendly. Remember, the higher men on newspapers are nearly all men who have been active newspaper men. There are very few who haven't. I don't know anybody on the Sun papers in any executive position who hasn't been through the mill. Do you?
No, I don't.
A man that hadn't been through the mill would be a rather useless man. He'd never be chosen for his job on grounds of merit, be some extraneous thing. But the newspaper guild began making demands, particularly on the weaker papers. They seemed to delight in the fact that they had when they got hold of a weak proprietor who simply was helpless. They had strikes. They tried to ruin the man. And in the end, they did ruin a good many of them. And it's a curious thing that all of the proprietors who were most friendly to him at the start were the men that they picked on for special persecution. For example, Davy Stern in Philadelphia, and that fellow in St. Petersburg, Florida, who I don't know him at all. But he reached a point where he could not operate his paper under the demands being made. And he had two choices. One was to fold his paper, sell it to somebody, or sell it to somebody, and the other choice was to fight him. He decided to fight him. He threw out all guilds and unions, although he was a sincere friend of unionism. He found there were a lot of old printers down in Florida who didn't, having tried for a while being retired, they didn't like it. They wanted to get back in the office and get a little ink on them. And he soon had a composing room staff. He found that there were many newspaper men who didn't like the Guild, but who did like working in Florida. Some of them came to see me when I was down there last winter, and they went down. He pays them fairly reasonable wages, and he's got his whole plant run by non-union people, and he's doing very well. And many other proprietors around the country are following suit, and I believe that some big city will make the break soon, and then you will see chaos. The unions will lose all they have gained by long years of work, particularly the typographical union, which was a very high-toned union, as you remember, run by men of intelligence, has lately got in the hands of extreme radicals whose main animating idea seems to be that the boss is a scoundrel, regardless of whether he is or not. That's a kind of a formal assumption that they make. And they're going to make it until someday the boss gets tired of it and throws them all out and keeps them out. There are papers at this minute that have no union organization whatever. One is one of the most prosperous papers in America, the Philadelphia Bulletin. Nobody in the Bulletin has to join a union. They have no prejudice against the union man. He can belong to the union all he pleases. He can work in the paper. They pay good wages, always a little above the union scale. That is up to now, always a little above. I think the union scales in some crafts are getting so preposterous that there'll come a time soon when newspaper proprietors will simply refuse to pay them.